Embassy of Sweden, Invest in Skåne, Mary, Louise, Accountancy, and Morgan Salmon, Amy, and Skanska, of course. Thank you so much, Ellen. And yesterday we had a bit more like an insight day, knowledge and insight day, so a little bit curious of any feedback or any highlights, so I want to hear more about this. Tatiana, do you have any spontaneous?
I had a great day in general yesterday because firstly now we know what everyone is doing.
Yeah.
And secondly, after last night, well, there was like a lot of interest from investor side as well, so just very productive day.
Great. Yeah, I think one of the great thing is being here and meeting people, just catching up. Yeah, get some connections. I think that's David, any other?
A lot of good LinkedIn contacts.
Yeah.
And I've realized that people actually use business cards. And I have none, and I felt like, what is going on? Why are so many people giving me a business card?
I've been using it for 2 years.
Exactly. The stock is like that at home. No, but it was very good yesterday, and it was good discussions with both people from this group and also from Estonia, which we met at the Ambassador's House.
Any other, or just move on? Well, great to see you here, and thank you again for coming over. So today is more the setting up operationally. We got a few questions. Hi Amy, welcome. And how to, we'll start with how to get your story out. We have Benjamin Webb here today, who will help us to understand how to work with that. And then we'll go over to the workshop, necessary steps to set up operationally. We had a few questions yesterday about accounting, basically. Louise will take that station. Talent and recruiting, Melina is here. And then regulatory and corporate law, Amy from Very Salmon will take that. So we will be divided into stations and move around to be able to talk freely. And also Benjamin will be staying as well if you have any more questions and discussions you want to bring up with Benjamin. And then we'll go over to Beyond London, opportunities across the UK. We have GE here, we have Chris Moore, Ben Balser, and Adam in this group. And it's been being moderated by Stefan Hansen, who is working outside. And then in the end, we will do a little bit like a pitch thing, like the company's gonna talk about their company, where they are in that phase, what they're looking for in terms of capital or guidance or any other input you want to have. And also then we have Adam and Zoe, who is a VC, entrepreneur turned VC in an foreign impact fund, who will be dealing with that. And then we'll finish off with networking and drinks here at Skanska tonight. So, Benjamin Webb, pleased to have you here. And if I introduce you, you're speaking of how to get the story out, and you have been working with lots of Scandic companies coming over. Wastefront, who we had yesterday, Christian, has been very pleased with what you've done.
He hasn't sacked us. That's
yeah, you're not sacked.
Good. I've been great.
He's very happy with that. So I'll leave up to you to explain more about your business.
Brilliant.
This one, right there.
Fabulous. I might stand at the lectern, which seems terribly formal. My name is Benjamin Webb. I run a company called Deliberate PR. For the better part of a decade, I've been blessed to bring the most interesting Nordic, primarily Swedish, unfortunately very few Baltic, I'm hoping that will change, startups and scale-ups to the UK. And I thought a sort of interesting place to start in terms of talking about how to get your story out there is looking at perhaps the history of how green issues have been discussed in the media. This article I found is supposedly the very first article in history, media article discussing climate change, from a completely unpronounceable New Zealand newspaper from 1912. Quite remarkable. But I think one of the things that, to discuss how to get your story out and use the UK media, I do not want this to turn into some extended advert for my company, though we charge very competitive prices with extraordinary results. But actually, the reality of how my company has grown and developed is inextricably linked to how Nordic startups have thrived. So to start with, to give you the background, when I started this company way back in 2007, I left journalism and I thought, with the arrogance of youth, that I would start a PR company because most PR people that I'd met as a journalist were complete morons. So I assumed that if the bar is set so low, it's not hard to be brilliant. And I was pretty great, and I decided to focus on arts and cultural clients to begin with. But the difference is, whereas most PR people spam journalists, my logic was find ways to set the news agenda and find ways to respond to the news agenda. Within 2 years, I was looking after Top Left, a band that millennials have never heard of. Top Right, the biggest arts festival in Europe. Bottom Right, not Kevin Spacey, though there is not a man in London under the age of 40, myself included, who does not have a Kevin Spacey story, should we say. But the most famous portrait artist in Britain, and various publishers. And the kinds of things that we used to do were effectively 90% culture and arts, with 10% technology dropped on top, so as to create a news story. This is a perfect example. We organised the world's first social media artwork at King's Cross train station. There was this exciting new technology called Twitter, 140 characters, as it then was, the length of a haiku, Japanese poetry. And we arranged for commuters in near real time to be able to tweet haikus about the weather, which is a British preoccupation. We then thought, who is the only Japanese person that British people know? Haiku Japanese. It's the lady who destroyed the Beatles. We persuaded her to act as a judge. This was the sort of thing that we were doing. Effectively 90% culture, 10% tech dropped on top. It was kind of going okay, but the problem is you work for artists, musicians, photographers, rampant egomaniacs, all of them, and they never pay their bills. And they actually believe you should be paying them for the privilege of working for them. But my life changed, personally, professionally, when I discovered Sweden. This was a project which I didn't really realize at the time was a super Swedish idea. It was an attempt to document a single day in human history through digital photography, organized by a charming man called Jeppe Wikström, who runs a publisher called Bokförlaget Maxström, part of the Bonnier Group. A very Swedish idea. But ideas like this are often doomed to failure. And the reason that they're doomed to failure is that the outcome, the whole world photographs itself over a 24-hour period, is terribly interesting. But the process of getting there is not interesting. So therefore no one signs up, no one takes part, there is no result. This was my moment of revelation. Because actually, the American media wasn't interested, the European media wasn't interested, but the British media thought this was the most brilliant idea. Now, the reason they thought this was a brilliant idea and wrote a lot about it was not because Instagram was in the ascendant. It was not because it was a cute idea. It was the fact that it was Swedish. Now, the British have always had an interest, and to my Baltic cousins, I will sort of lump you into this group. The British have always had a love affair with Sweden and the Nordics. But it was about 10 years ago that this morphed from being an occasional event into a full-blown obsession. This is from a satirical news site from 5 years ago, which kind of, there we go, coupled with vague socialist ideas and a fondness for gloomy crime dramas, think they're actually becoming Swedish. And I realized that this preoccupation with Sweden extended beyond the cultural media and crossed over into the business media. Swede, Sweden, Swedish, it's in the headline, it's emblematic of something aspirational to which British people aspire and wish to pursue. Now this was a moment where Spotify had obviously crossed into the mainstream, so 2012. You could walk down Kungsgatan is in Stockholm, isn't it? Yes, I remember my street name. And you could throw a rock and you would hit someone on the back of the head who had a startup. It was a boom time in Sweden. But the thing is, a lot of these Swedes, these Swedish startups, were going straight to America where they would sink without trace. Now I love and adore the Swedes. I owe you everything, and I really value you highly. The thing is, even though Nordic businesses and Swedes, you are often the smartest people in the room, you have the best design, you've invented a solution to a problem that people didn't even know they had, you are terrible, terrible at marketing yourselves. And you also rarely survive first contact with an American. And so I thought to myself, well, hold on, if all these Americans are going straight to America, where they're sinking without trace. Sweden, Switzerland, Swaziland, they don't care. They genuinely don't care. Why not come to the UK, where the media adores you because you are Nordic, and you can actually leverage this to your advantage? Because actually the British, and it's more or less all we have left now, we have the language that the world speaks, and therefore our media is disproportionately influential. But why? What is the motivation for getting big in Britain and using the UK media? Well, number one, the international investment community from Shanghai to Singapore to Sao Paulo does its business in English. They don't care that it's Bloomberg London, it's Bloomberg. They don't care that it's CNBC Europe, it's CNBC. So therefore, that's a clear motivation. Recruitment, it aids in recruitment to have a media profile. An explanation of what a business actually does, what it will do, and the problem that it might solve. Editorial media, I would always argue, an article where an independent journalist has chosen to write about your company and explain why it's going to be incredible, explain why the founder is so visionary, is far more impactful with specific segments that you're trying to reach than an advert. And also strategic and commercial partners giving ammunition for sales teams. If you have a sales team, then obviously there is a huge difference between hello, you've never heard of us, would you like a meeting? And hello, we were on CNBC last week, would you like a meeting? Conference organisers also want people on stage who have a media presence. And I think the final point on the page is, it is easier to go from the Financial Times to the Wall Street Journal than it is Duggan's Industry to the Wall Street Journal. So you create a foundation in the UK and then you use it by way of leverage. So fast forward several years, not necessarily out of choice, but just the reality of the market, we have found ourselves looking after a whole load of pretty amazing Nordic companies, many of which either directly or indirectly have a sustainability or green tech flavour to them. Some I list there. And also in parallel to this, the media landscape, and again, I'm kind of insulting intelligence here by stating the obvious. The media has gone, and I'm old enough to remember, when climate change, global warming, these were discussions by science editors, and they were also something of a fringe opinion, a fringe interest, shall we say. Now, pretty much every single major UK title has a dedicated environmental section. And correspondingly, Bloomberg, if you look at the bottom right, the Bloomberg Green section, a lot of its content is European, which is going global, but being produced by the London Bureau. From here on in, I thought it'd be quite useful to look at some of the types of ways in which green tech companies might be discussed in the media. So you can think to yourselves, before you come over here and employ me, you can think to yourselves about what your company can do in order to prepare itself for media exposure. So the first thing, the profile of the business and senior team. Now, the media, and it may seem slightly superficial, but the media is preoccupied by a strong voice from within the company. So one of the things you need to think about is, who is the person who talks to media? If you have 5 founders, work out who's the media facing one. Work out who's going to talk to the business media, who's going to talk to the technology media. This is an important starting point. Secondly, startups presenting a solution to a problem. Now, one of the things I think a lot of startups, green tech or otherwise, forget is that they have quirky names, they have a lovely website, but they don't bother explaining the problem to which they are providing a solution. They almost assume by some sort of psychic process of osmosis that people will understand from your quirky named company what you fix. Whereas actually, very often, the first story for most green tech startups is the codification or quantification of a problem that they solve. In the past 2 weeks, I've spoken to 2 Swedish companies, one of which is concerned with bottled glass bottles and the incredibly wasteful process of their production. Another one, paper production. Now, I had no idea that both of these processes are insanely wasteful. So therefore, that will be their first news story, a quantification of the problem that they solve. Moving from hypothetical concept to real world application. Now, waste funds on the left, I'm sure some of you met Christian yesterday. They are a client of ours, hence why I included this, because I didn't want to piss off Christian, but he's not here anyway. But here we are. So one of the things you need to think about is, you can talk in hypothetical terms about how you will solve a problem. But actually what the media needs is evidence that you are doing it. So, I mean, perfect case in point, on the left, Wastefront, it's opening a plant. And I hasten to add, the plant at this moment in time is being produced. It's not finished, but there was news in the fact that they'd signed a deal. On the right-hand side, Compensate, which is a Finnish carbon capture analysis company, for want of a better expression, they teamed up with the LSE. So one of the things you need to think about is, how do you give the media something tangible? Everybody thinks their company is going to change the world. Everybody's confident of this fact. That doesn't mean the media will be interested in your promise or your potential. So you need to think about how you cross into the mainstream. I mean, again, this is similar in theme. Exeger, which is a the integration of solar cells within consumer electronics. Their first major product. On the right-hand side, Maniga from Iceland. They signed a deal with an Icelandic bank. This is something which I think is worth taking note of. The British media is obsessed with your countries of origin and actually thinks that data and stories from your countries of origin are newsworthy. Because there is this established narrative that where you are now, Nordic people and Baltic people, we, the British, will be in 7 months' time. Now, Italian, German, French, Spanish, with the utmost respect, grazie mille to the Italians in the room, the British media views data from those countries as being very different to us. It's not transferable. Whereas the Nordics and I guess the Baltics, it works. So think about things you're doing domestically, because they might actually make a news story here. Also think to yourself about how your technology is benefiting society, but also case studies. Case studies, super important. If people are using your technology already, make sure they are prepared to be cooperative. So Oda from Norway on the left, Cake on the right, these are further examples of things that we've been able to do using case studies. Setting the news agenda, you need to think to yourself, how can we put together some data point, some collaboration, something which will allow us to set the news agenda. So going back to these people that I mentioned before, Compensate, the Finns concerned with carbon capture, they put together a report which effectively debunked roughly 90% of the carbon capture schemes out there. That is a news story, self-evidently. This is slightly back to front, but in terms of doing it, but we look after a Swedish, I guess scale-up you call it now, called Fishbrain, an app for anglers, no less. They passed 1 million users in America and said, should we put out a press release saying we passed 1 million users in America? So I said, well, probably not. Why don't you do something with the 1 million users? So we brokered a deal for them with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, which meant that the 1 million US users of the app were being used to crowdsource information on endangered species. So think to yourselves, is there something my platform is doing, my app is doing, which we can get into bed with a charity or some campaigning organisation, some research organisation in order to create news? You'd be relieved to hear we're nearly at the end of this. Responding to news opportunities, this actually isn't a particularly good sustainability example, but one of the things I want you to think about is every single day, when you read or you hear or you see a news story and you think to yourself, I am qualified to comment on this, and whoever is giving comment is an idiot, and I'm much better than them, my company should be the one that is being showcased, then that is reason enough for you to actually pick up the phone, call media, and give it a go. So I mean, this is a perfect case in point. Stanford introduces ethics within its technology course. We were looking after Hyper Island at the time, that obviously, bless the Swedes, been doing this for years. We were able to jump on this story and turn it to their advantage. Funding rounds, I'm sure you all are at different stages in terms of pursuing funding. Don't fixate on funding rounds as a media angle. The media will write them up, but I think a lot of companies think, okay, we've got our funding story, that's it, that's our media strategy for the year, done. It doesn't quite work like that. However, and these are other examples of funding rounds we've placed, it does present a flag in the ground. Just try and make it interesting. Conferences, one of the things to think about is that conference organizers not only want people on stage who are interesting, but they also want people who are newsworthy. And one of the tricks that we have learned is that you get a client to attend a conference, and then roughly 3 or 4 days before the conference takes place, you get the client to say something newsworthy, as you can see in this example here. You then go to the conference organizers and say, look, I've said this newsworthy thing in the media. The conference organizers are profoundly grateful for this free PR, so they then choose to amplify it here, there, and everywhere. And finally, in terms of examples of media coverage, one of the things we've done in the past 10 years is bring journalists over to the Nordics. I think a lot of Swedes and Norwegians assume in their well-meaning way that many of these articles about how wonderful the land of Spotify is, or Norway after oil, all of this, these are happening as a result of merit. It's a very Scandinavian way to interpret things. It's not. We are flying the journalists over, we are putting them in a hotel, we are introducing them perhaps to an actor or actress from some depressing TV crime show that they like, and then introducing them to a whole load of companies. They then go back to America or to London and write these wonderful pieces about there's so much exciting stuff going on. My point is, don't pretend to be British if you come to Britain. You may have a country manager, you may have a British office. Don't fall into the trap of assuming you have to feign being British. I have a German client who explained to me in no uncertain terms, it is very important that people think that I am British. And I had to say to him, and Peter, as his name was, no one's going to believe that. In fact, leverage your Europeanness for all it's worth. So in summation, in terms of things to think about, number one, the need for a concise creation myth, or indeed creation story. Get this all sorted out. What inspired you to create your business? What inspired you to found it? What personal experience of one of the founders led to it? Nail that. Cult of personality, the charismatic CEO, well, the Swedes here, and indeed the Norwegians, be Jante, but not too Jante. Also, identify the people within your organization who are in-house experts, who are people who can be deployed. It's not always the CEOs, it's not always the founders. Work out who can talk to media. Think about news stories that are relevant to you and your startup, because that is a way to turbocharge everything that you do. There's a news story about solar and you're in the solar space, jump on it. You've got something to say. And also find ways to set the news agenda. Going back to this point about the problem that you solve, think about this, because actually that can be the first news story. Just because you've spent years creating a solution to a problem that you are very familiar with, don't assume the rest of the world appreciates what you're fixing. And the thing that you're fixing might be the news story. Less about potential, more about results. Now, I suppose the point I'm trying to make here is, if you have case studies, if you have users, if you have proof that people want your product, then get that ready. Think about partnerships, charitable academic relationships bolster credibility. If you have academics on board, if you have charities that you might team up with, do something with them. For the love of Thor, there we go, don't use PR news wires. This is something Americans love doing, where they will, and I adore Americans, don't get me wrong, but what they will do is they will pay $1,000 to basically spam 1,000 journalists and assume that this is how you talk to media. It is a way to kill your brand, almost instantly. Try to avoid emailing journalists, phone them, treat media with respect, and they will respect you. Journalists are not your enemy, but they're certainly not your friend. One thing which I always say to Nordic individuals, and they always ignore me, is I say at the end of the interview with a journalist, even though it is standard in Sweden and Norway for them to send you a copy of the article prior to publication to proof your quotes, you do this with a British or American journalist, you will offend them to such a degree that what was a really pleasant conversation will suddenly turn very nasty. The first thing they'll say is, do you think I can't do my job? The second thing they'll say is, are you trying to pervert the authenticity and independence of my copy? This is a peculiar, charming Nordic thing which does not cross over elsewhere.
Has that happened many times?
Yes. I always say it, and it's always ignored, but it is what it is. Exploit brand Nordics and Baltics. Media will even take success in your homeland as proof that you're interesting and relevant. And actually, there's a point here. If you have generous investors, or you have relationships with esteemed international organizations that are involved in your promotion, it's probably worth thinking about inviting journalists to visit you. The reality is, if you have something to show them, that is, which presumably you do. I mean, the reality is, it's been 2 and a bit years where British journalists used to travelling, used to going on junkets, haven't been able to go anywhere. So what we're already finding is we're trying to bring journalists over to Norway, over to Sweden over the next 2 or 3 weeks. There's a queue of people wanting to basically get the hell out of Britain and eat toast scargan and do their thing. So invite them to visit you. It can't hurt. Because the one thing about being in summation, about being a relatively unknown company with the utmost respect, without a media profile, is that nobody hates you. Nobody wants to take you down. Nobody wants to undermine what you're promising to do. In fact, you're still new, you're still exciting. Turn that to your advantage. There we go. Am I over time?
Perfect.
Really? Okay.